Oh, I was just getting ready to sing that song, but I lost the words. Da 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 da. The church is one foundation, right? Is Jesus Christ her Lord? I guess they decided to turn it off at the right spot. They know better. What's that? That's okay. You don't want to hear me sing it anyway. Well, we want to continue on our discussion, and for those of you who might be watching by the internet, if you missed the first two discussions, the first two teachings on the biblical basis of missions and the history of missions, you've missed a lot, and I'd encourage you to go to our archives at www.fbcaltoona.org and get followed up on that. And this symposium is basically put together for our church leadership, but we are sharing it with you folks, and that's why we even have it here in the sanctuary of our church, so that we could get it out to those of you who are watching by way of the internet. And we are in our missions conference, and I have no idea where some of you are watching from, whether you're looking on the internet or Facebook Live or whatever, but our theme for our conference this year is sent to the whosoever, taken from Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 17. And so if you are in the Altoona, Pennsylvania area, we invite you to come. Tonight at 6 o'clock, I'm speaking on Saturday morning now, the 13th of April. Tonight at 6 o'clock, we'll be having a session. It's going to be the presentation of the Passover supper, the Seder, and you're invited to come out to that. And then, of course, tomorrow morning at 9:30, we have a combined Sunday school. 10:30, our morning service tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. And then Monday through Wednesday, each night at 7 o'clock. And all of that is open to the public. And I'm certain that many of you here in the Altoona area probably have your own churches to go to, and that's fine, that's good. But, if throughout the course of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we'd love to have you to be involved, and we'd invite you to come on out. So go to our website, which is www.fbcaltoona.org, and there you can see what's coming up in our conference. The schedule is there, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call at 944-2894. That's 814-944-2894. We are amazed at where we hear from, nations we hear from through this internet ministry. So if you're living in Ghana, we don't expect you to drop by. But if you're in the Altoona area, we'd love to have you drop by and be a part of our gathering. Well, our next discussion, I should say our next presentation, is going to be on the current state of missions. Ben Woodring spent 28 years down in the Dominican Republic, and he has a lot of experiences. His son Dan is down there right now, and he's just telling me that he's going to be down there in the month of July to see the grandchildren. I don't think you said anything about Dan and Barb, just the grandchildren. They're probably included. But we're going to invite Ben Woodring to come and share with us the current situation in missions. Ben, come on up, brother, and thank you for being willing to share. God bless.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be together this morning, and I just wanted to let you know that a lot of the diagrams in that which I will be using are not original with me. They have been put out by Joshua Project, and then different ones, Operation World, Atlas of Global Christianity, Jesus Film Project, Wycliffe Bible Translators, Frontier Ventures, and Mission Frontiers. To give credit where credit's due, these are the ones that did the diagrams, and I'm not very capable of doing all of that. I'm still pretty old-fashioned when it comes to computers. I did have a Mac that went down on me. I could do a lot more on the Mac than I can do on the one I'm on now. But anyway, You know, when it comes to missions today, I've been outside of the missions, so as to speak, for 20 years, and so I had to really seek to find out what's happening today in a real sense. So I don't pretend to be an expert in missions, unless this is your definition of an expert. What is an expert? X is an unknown quantity. A spurt's a drip under pressure. In that sense, I'm an expert this morning. But thinking of missions today, there's been a great shift in the percentage of Christians in America, North America, and Europe over the years, which I guess we see here. Back in the 1800s, 99% of Christians were in North America and Europe, and only 1% were in Latin America, Asia, Africa. Think of that. In 1979, it was 50% each. In 2018, 23% in Europe and North America, 77%. That's amazing. Talk about change. The reality is that the world is changing and missions is changing along with it. And, you know, as I think of missions, Esther and I had the privilege of going to the Dominican Republic in 1969, a few years ago. And we go down every 2 years, take work teams from the area. We've had them from Grace Baptist in Tyrone, and from Tipton Baptist, from Zion Bible Church in York, where I was formerly the pastor. And it's been wonderful to take our people that these churches have been involved in that ministry from 1969. Now they can go back and be a part of it and see it. And the changes are tremendous. For instance, I would just like to use an illustration, Hakagwa, where we've been taking our work teams to the school there, and it's where Johnny has his camp area. We went there into that community. I call it my Macedonian call. Why? Well, because if I'd have driven through that community, it would have been the last community I would have chosen to do a church plant. It just wasn't what you would consider the right place. There were other things in my mind. We had just come back off of furlough, and we turned our church that we had originally worked over to a national. And so we were praying. And one morning, two strange ladies came into the church service. And they started talking to some of the ladies of the church after the meeting, and they said, do you have anyone that would like to go to our community and share the gospel? This lady just accepted Christ, and there's no Christians in her community. Well, they came up to Esther and I because they knew we were looking for a new church plant. That afternoon, we went out, and she had her house full of people. And that's how the work in Hakagwa. Now, Hakagwa was outside of the second largest city, but it was pretty much from the Dark Ages at that point in time. All roads that were dirt. The rainy season, you could easily get stuck trying to get in and out. There were no telephones. We spent 5 years there without any communication whatsoever. We had a phone number in the city that people would call, and I'd stop by when I was in the city, find out, did anybody call us? Anything come up? Any needs? You know, things change. At that time, I had the only vehicle in that community. Esther was a LPN, so she helped people out physically. But those that she couldn't take care of, guess who got the job taking them to the hospital? I had the ambulance service. It was okay till 3 nights in a row I had 3 different ladies come at 2 o'clock in the morning going to have their babies. That wasn't, got a little sleepy after that. But the fact is that was part of the way that we were able to share Christ's love with those people. Now it's interesting, today, that community has paved streets. It has arc lights. There are probably 100 cars in that community. And the house we lived in was a palm board house, an old palm board house with a tin roof. At that point, it was one of the nicest. Not nice, but one of the nicest. Today, it's probably the worst one in the community. Things have changed, and so do missions, and how we do missions. And the fact is that God is still working. And as we look at the great shift, for every one new believer that we have in North America or Europe, there are over or nearly 30 new believers in Nigeria, Brazil, and China. God is at work in missions today. Also, receivers are becoming senders. The fact is that there's a rise in African, Asian, and Latin American missionaries going from their countries and sharing the gospel. Nowadays, the number of international missionaries from the global south is increasing compared to the past, when it was mainly the west to the rest. That's what it used to be. But that is not happening nowadays as much. The traditional missionary receiving countries have now become sending countries, which is positive. Some of these changes are very positive. Some of them we might question, but the fact is that that is taking place is a real blessing. For instance, there's Korean missionaries now working in Central Asia, Brazilian missionaries in North Africa, Filipino missionaries in the Far East. So the fact is that the global South, who was accustomed to receiving missionaries from the North, even see the decline in Christian faith in the North. And they feel a debt of gratitude to the North for being evangelized, and now they feel the need to re-evangelize us. The fact is that there are many who are working from these Latin countries in the North to help us. So that is a change, that we used to be the sending country, and we still are in that sense, but we're not the only ones. We thank the Lord for what is taking place. Also, there's a change in that we have the urban focus. The urban focus. Today, the majority of the unreached people live in the jungle of the cities, not in the real jungle. In the past, much of mission endeavor was focused on rural areas. But today, many international missionaries go to the major cities to do their ministry. Because people are flooding into the cities from the countryside in search of jobs, this often separates them from the family and friends which they have, and it opens them up to the gospel. They don't have that stigma that against them that, if I come to Christ, my family will reject me, and that kind of thing. For instance, in the Dominican Republic, type of ministries that can go on there have changed considerably. We used to do a lot of door-to-door evangelism. In fact, in our last church plant in a part of Santiago, the second largest city, called Cienfuegos, as we were getting our believers getting new believers, we were training them to go out and do an interview with people and talk to them about if they have a Bible and so forth, and if they would be interested in a Bible study. And we would go back every week and have Bible studies with them. We went out one evening. We came back and had 40 Bible studies to give. That was a blessing, but it was a work. It was work. But you know, it's getting harder and harder to do that in the Dominican Republic, especially with the upper class. Why? Because now they lived in walled-in houses. There's gates that have locks on them. They won't answer their gate. So things are changing. As I go back to the Dominican Republic every 2 years, I can see these changes taking place. And so missions has to develop, how can we reach these individuals? Next, world mission is nowadays on our doorstep. Our cities have become multicultural. For instance, Reading, Pennsylvania, half of the population are Latins. You go there and you hear as much Spanish as you do English. In many districts, the majority of the population comes from abroad. Many of our international neighbors are already followers of Christ. When they come here, and we must learn how to minister to their needs as a congregation. In other words, we as congregations need to be there to minister to our fellow brothers and sisters that come from afar. Other international residents who come here never heard the gospel. World missions is on our doorstep. Mission agencies and missionaries with international experience and language skills can help the local churches fulfill the Great Commission here in America. World missions no longer is just sending missionaries abroad. It is that, but it also is a network of relationships and ministries from everywhere to everywhere, using what God has given us to share the good news. So world missions is in our midst. Also, we know there's much taking place as far as witness to migrants. Today, there are so many that are migrants in our world. Many of these have moved involuntarily. It's under the pressure. Refugees fleeing from conflict. Therefore, there is an increase in seeking to reach these groups. Eventually, if they come to know Christ, they could take the gospel message back to the areas that maybe the foreigners can't get in to where they are. Now, I had the privilege, while I was pastoring in York, Pennsylvania, at Zion Bible Church, of working in the prison. They have a lot of INS Latins from all over South and Central America in prison there. And so I would have a weekly Bible study, and many accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. And I have received letters from back there, for they go back to their own country. And they continue to follow the Lord and are serving the Lord. Not all of them, but I received letters from several. And so even if we're here in America for some reason or another, we still have a ministry to those who are out of their countries. Also, there's a change in missions. The witness through global economy. In other words, our economy is global nowadays. Business is gaining an integral role in international missions, while the doors of many unreached countries are closing to the Christian traditional missionary. The global economy of today is causing these countries to be open to professionals to minister in those areas. In God's sovereign plan, there are many opportunities for Christians to go to unreached people and places around the world through this global ministry. These Christian professionals are finding opportunities to take jobs, to excel in those jobs, and to glorify God by doing it, and opportunities to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. This has touched even those countries where the gospel has already been heard. But there are special groups within those countries that has more or less been outside of the gospel ministry. For instance, Pastor mentioned our son Dan went back to the Dominican Republic as a part-time business person. Now, he originally was considering going back with Cross World. That's the mission we were under, UFM International before. And they were stressing how important it is to reach the business people. For instance, the traditional missionary has reached a class of people, but the majority of the people that are professionals in our churches and so forth were saved as children, young people, and became professionals. But to reach the professional, you need someone on their level. And so Dan was at Cross World, and they challenged him with this. And Dan looked at Barb and said, doesn't sound like us. Business person? Well, a few years back, he had worked for Allegheny York, which is a company that sells, old age, sells seals and for machinery and so forth. And the day Dan said, that doesn't sound like us, Dan and Barb prayed and said, Lord, if you want us to go as business personnel, you're going to have to show us. The very next morning, Dan opened up his email, and he didn't know the guy in York knew anything about him going back to the Dominican. And in that email, he said, Dan, would you represent my country in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean? Talk about God saying, woo, this is it. God made it clear. God wanted to use business to reach that class of people through Dan. Now, he's doing mission work as far as encouraging the churches to do church planting together. He's not heading it up. He's just encouraging them, working with them and doing that, because down through the years they have neglected to do that. And so we're thankful that God is leading in that way, and that Dan is able to have this ministry through economic relationships, through work. Also, there's a great change in growth in technology. The new communication technologies have revolutionized our world. As I have mentioned before, Esther and I lived in Chicago and no telephone for 5 years. You go to the Dominican Republic today on a work team and you'll see 100 young people walking around with one of these. You know, I could right now dial Dan up and say, hi Dan, how you doing? What's up? Do it instantly. It has changed our world. Information travels around the world in seconds, and the most remote places in the world now are connected. It is a factor in missions today. is influencing many aspects of missions. For instance, we can communicate with our missionaries as well as with those Christians in diverse places on the mission field where we cannot have a missionary present there all the time. There's always that relationship. I am able to carry on a relationship with my children in the faith that are pastors of churches down there now. I can go on, what's up? How's it going? What prayers do you have? What's happening? As a result, there's high expectations from their supporters, from their missionaries too. We are even able to enjoy a church service in the Dominican Republic every Sunday afternoon, right here. We can see the pastors that are preaching Sunday afternoon in this new church plant that they are doing together, and Dan puts it on the internet. A real blessing. The fact is that truly we are blessed, and we must take advantage of what there is technologically to continue to fulfill that mission. Also, there's today, because of the technology, oral witness. In the past, missionaries had to create a written language. If a group had no language, they had to find a written language, and they had to translate the Bible and teach the people how to read. With today's technology, Bible translation increasingly is strictly oral, expediting translation into language that still lacks a written form. Missionaries nowadays are turning to an audio and video resources rather than the print to share with people who cannot, will not, or prefer not to read. In other words, we have here, we need audio Bibles, stories, and non-book training. 60% of the world are oral learners. They can't read. And we have that opportunity to do that. Now, for missionaries, even their support, how they are supported has changed dramatically in the last several years. This trend is that of supporting few missionaries with most or their complete support. It is taking root within our churches in America today. Whether you agree with or disagree with it, that's what is taking place. Instead of supporting many missionaries with a little bit of money each one, many large churches especially are choosing to do their own membership only and support them with a great amount. Now, there are reasons that we need to understand why this choice is being made. You can be more involved with that missionary on the field and at home. When they come home, they can spend time with that local church or those local churches. In other words, it's hard to build an intimate relationship with 50, 60 people. But if you have 2 or 3 that you really focus on, it's easier to focus on them and have an intimate relationship. That type of support makes it difficult for the missionary and his family when he comes back to the States, when he has so many supporting churches from California to Florida to Maine. It makes it very difficult. They need to travel, share, give thanks. But you know, this trend is affecting the missionaries coming from a small church. It's been said that the small church has this idea: listen, The Great Commission has been funded and fueled largely by young people from small, royal churches. It says it would be a terrible shame if the larger churches were to take over the mission sending enterprise and leave out the smaller churches just because they weren't able to fully support a missionary. And I know this is affecting missions today, raising support. I know when Dan went to Crossworld, the trend seems to be today not get as much support from local churches, but from individuals. And again, if you only have a small nucleus of individuals that you're close to, that makes it tough to get to the mission field. And our son dealt with issues similar to that. Back in my day, the mission would send us to a large church and they'd say, we want to support you. That doesn't happen nowadays. And it makes it rough on missionaries. And I think we need to be conscious of what is taking place and how hard it's going to be for missionaries to come from small churches. There is the idea, well, if several churches in the same area decide this person is worthwhile, let's work together, let's do this. I think that's what it's going to take in order for that to happen. Short-term missions is important because it prepares people, lets them see the work. Now again, we understand that young people today, many of them aren't like they were years ago. I went to the mission field, I didn't know what I was getting into. But you know, short-term missions, whether it's a work team or whatever it may be, can really be a positive thing. Just last couple of trips we made to the Dominican Republic, a young lady from Grace Baptist Church in Tyrone, she's saying, God's called me back to the Dominican Republic. And so this is an important aspect, and I do want to say, we're going, not this summer, we're taking a work team next summer. So love to have some faith people with us on that work team to the Dominican Republic. There's still much to be done. There's much to be done. Growing absolute number of non-believers in the world is growing. In 2000, there were around 4 billion non-believers. In 2018, we've added 20 billion. However, global mission workforce has plateaued. The need has increased. We listen to the year 2000, cross-cultural missionaries, there were 4,200 missionaries. In 2018, there were 440,000 missionaries cross-culturally. Only 26% annual growth in cross-cultural missionaries with that great number of increased non-believers. There's work to be done. God help us, God lead us in accomplishing that. Thank you very much. God bless. You have the questions, but I might not have the answers.
Taking some pictures there of your slides. You talked about migrant workers, or missions to the immigrants, whatever. Do you know, and of course that's in the news all the time anymore, do you know with some of these migrants that are coming across our southern borders, et cetera, are there ministries, are there opportunities to reach out to them in Christ going on right now? Do you know of any mission organization that is trying to present them with the gospel?
I personally do not. I'm sure there are those that are doing it, but I personally do not have knowledge of that.
Yeah. And sometimes those of us who are up here in Pennsylvania say, well, we're 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles away from the border, but you mentioned in Reading, just 150 miles from us, half their population is Hispanic.
Yeah.
That seems to be a trend down in the Lancaster, Lebanon,
Even York is
York
growing
getting that
quite a
way
bit.
too.
Yeah.
We don't see it as much here
No.
right now, but that's not to say that we won't. But what do you think that the church needs to do today, perhaps, to equip themselves for these migrants that are coming into their community?
Well, I guess, again, as when we were in York, we tried to reach into the Latins that were there on the street. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a lot of success. For a couple of months, we were in Reading, and we would visit in the prisons there and try to contact the families. And they thought we were working for the government, and they didn't even want to answer the door.
Yeah.
So I think, again, as we come in contact with them, we need to try to reach out to them and even invite them into our churches. We tried at one time to get a Spanish work going in our church in York, but it really didn't get off the ground because, but as they move in, we who know Spanish need to reach out to them.
I know that there are churches that are doing that. Faith Baptist Church down in Lebanon has reached out. Lebanon is really growing with Spanish-speaking
Right.
people. And in fact, we support Bill Fonmiller and his wife are down there in Faith Baptist reaching out
Right.
to that particular group. But it's just, it's been said in recent years that the world is coming. The lost are coming to the lost of the world are coming to the
Right.
United States of
Yeah.
America, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't go. We need to be willing to go, but we ought to take advantage of what's coming to us as well with the gospel message.
I know that there's a church in Reading that we have visited. Dan worked in it a little while he was in the area. And they have, what happens a lot with the Latins, the older people don't know English. They don't want to learn English. The children don't want to speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. And so what they do, they have their morning worship service. They have, every song is sung in Spanish and English. Then they have the preaching service, which one time it's in Spanish in the English Sunday school. Then it's switched around.
Wow.
So they're using both languages. So the older people are comfortable with their Spanish, and the children and young people are comfortable with their English. So
That's
you have to adapt to your situation, because what happens a lot is the Spanish churches eventually lose the young people because they want to be in English.
yeah.
So he's had a good work done.
Very interesting. Okay, sir. Thank you very,
Thank
very
you.
much. One final question as you're sitting down. Do you know Bob Myers?
I knew him, yes.
Was in Dominican with
Yes.
Baptist Mid-Mission?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
He was in the Capitol.
Yeah.
Yeah, I met him, knew him.
Yeah.
Not real well, but I
Yeah,
did know him.
Okay, it just dawned on me, that has nothing to do with what we're doing today. But just wondered if you might have known Bob. I got to know Bob down in Ecuador. He worked along with one of our missionaries, Carlene Piper, who of course is sent out from our church. Well, like I said, we are learning an awful lot on the concept of missions. And I guess when we talk about the current state of missions, we almost get into where we're going in the future. And so that's what we're going to do right now. As soon as we get this guy mic'd up, we're going to hear from Johnny Rodriguez, which really, he is from DR, Dominican Republic, with Koinodos. And we had the opportunity of meeting him a couple of months ago. So we're inviting him to come and just share with us a little bit about what we can expect in the future. Come on up, Brother Johnny, and share what we can expect for the future as it relates to missions. And good to have you with us. Good to have you back.
Good to be here.
Wax eloquent.
Thank you very much, church. To me and my wife, it is one more time a privilege to be here. And I will try to do as best as I can. I know that we are all tired and sleepy and hungry. So I'm going to try to fight against that. That is a challenge. Not to mention the challenge of the topic that I have been assigned, the future of missions. Who knows? But we'll try. Last night, as Pastor Gary was reviewing the schedule for today, he was going over who was doing what this morning. He mentioned Brother Woodring was talking about the actual state of missions, and at one point he literally said, Johnny is the future of missions. And that phrase right there, and I know he was just talking about what my topic was for the day, but it just, I felt in my heart the huge responsibility and the privilege that it was for me. I actually looked around the room and the ages represented in that room, and I said, indeed, I am the future of missions.
That's why you got that topic.
Amen. I know you're a smart pastor. So I looked around, and with all respect, I looked at the ages represented, and I said, indeed, we are. I am the future of missions. And like I said, I felt the great responsibility and privilege, especially because we were sitting in that room among now fellow missionaries from a generation that had a huge impact in our lives. And I know that for both my wife and I, actually when we got to the apartment, my wife shared almost the same thing. And we didn't talk at that moment last night, but when we got to the apartment, she said almost the same thing about how she felt that responsibility and that privilege of being among missionaries from a generation that has had a great impact in our lives. And I want to thank to those who are here, who are serving, who are from another generation, who are still in the field. I want to thank you and just praise God for your work and that you continue to do. A long time ago, we were part of the actual state of mission back then as the fruit of missionaries who had no idea that we were going to be part of the future of missions back then. And here we are. I had the privilege to be here a couple months ago, and now we're back to talk about this topic that I had no clue about how it's going to look like. Figure that. And if you know, then we need to talk, because you have some powers that I don't have. What I do know is that the future of mission, to understand the future, if we part from the fact that future is, we refer as future as the things to come, right? We need to understand that definitely we cannot predict future, but we can predict the way that people act and the way that people behave, the demographics, and how that is affecting everything. And it happened in the Bible. As we understand people's behavior, we will be able to have a glimpse of how things are going to look like in the future. And just like Brother Woodring was sharing, the lack of understanding of people's behavior will definitely affect the strategy to take place in missions and for the local church. And my wife and I are seeing that, and an example is what's happening here in Patterson, New Jersey. And I don't want to talk about only international missions, but also locally. But we have the privilege to be based for a period of time in Patterson, New Jersey, where Madison Avenue Baptist Church has hosted us as members while we're here. And what has happened there is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that the lack of understanding of people's behavior and demographics will definitely affect in a negative way or a positive way the strategy of the local church. In that church, right now, we are going through a transition from predominantly white American Baptist conservative church to a multicultural church. Patterson, New Jersey, back in 2014, had only a 6% of their population were white Americans. Right now, 3 years later, you figure it. I'm pretty sure that it's way less. Most of the people who lived in Patterson, and I'm talking this process has been taking place for the last 20 years, but now over 35% of the population of Patterson, New Jersey is Hispanic. Not only Mexicans, Latino, Hispanic, from all over the place. 20% blacks, and 20-something% other nationalities. And that's here in the United States. So I'm pretty sure that that is affecting tremendously the strategy of Madison Avenue Baptist Church in Patterson, New Jersey. Can you imagine what's going on globally? How demographics are changing, how people's behaviors and interactions are changing, the way that the Middle East is nowadays looking at the Americans, and how people in Africa don't take very well things coming from the United States, then who will go for them? And that is how we can probably start understanding how missions will look like in the future. Like I said, I can't predict, but if we understand, if we pay attention to the way that people behave and how they have behaved, then we can come up with an idea of how things are going to look like, and then we can establish a strategy that will fit in that time. And people in the Bible, they had a good understanding, and I can, for example, quote John the Baptist. And I don't want to go into the definition of missions. We already heard great definitions of missions and how we should look at missions. But I want to share this definition real quick, which is definitely different and involves, it groups both local and international mission, where it says that, and it is not my definition, transfer of responsibility for the gospel to those who do not yet bear that responsibility, that goes beyond any cultural, racial, or language barrier.
That's good. Can you repeat it?
I will. Transfer of responsibility for the gospel to those who do not yet bear that responsibility, that trespasses racial, cultural, language barriers. That's different. And then I add that in that process of transferring that responsibility, evangelism needs to happen. There is no way that non-believers will carry that responsibility. Discipleship of believers needs to happen. We need to change the perspective of life of a new believer to a biblical perspective of life of a mature Christian, and that is done through discipleship. Training and equipping. And this happens while this group of new believers who are now mature believers are mentoring others and sharing that responsibility of transmitting the gospel to them. And it just go on and on and on and on. So how this is going to continue to happen as people change and their demographics change, it's uncertain. But we can have an idea. And let's go to the Bible and take a look at what happened with John the Baptist and other people in the Bible. In John 3:30, and we don't have to go there, but John's conclusion and how the future of missions look for John, I can resume in one sentence when he said, he must become greater, I must become less. That right there is a transition of John's the Baptist present in his missions ministry to the future of ministry in the gospel. Then when we look at Jesus in Matthew 28:18-20 to his disciple, we all know about the Great Commission. That right there was the perfect example of a transition from the disciples or Jesus' present in mission to the disciples' future in mission. Go and make disciples. We can also talk about Peter in the book of Acts and that interaction in between Peter and Cornelius. When in Acts 10:34-45, he said, God does not show favoritism. And right there started the change from Peter's present in mission to the Gentiles' future in mission. So if we look at Romans 15, 1934, we can understand that a lot of these concepts would just keep repeating in time. But we also need to understand that we need to apply these biblical concepts to people who are changing, to people whose demographics, language, culture are changing. Okay, and we can see an example of that in Romans 15 when Paul talks to us about his experience with Rome, Spain, and Jerusalem. And we can go there. I'm actually going to stay there for the rest of my hour that I have here. Yeah. At least I'm staying there. So Romans 15, and you're going to have to bear with my broken English and King James Version. 19 says, through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto, how do you pronounce that, Pastor? Illyricum? I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. Just so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest or least I should build upon another man's foundation. So Paul here in this first few chapters of that passage is expressing his desire to go from where he actually said there is no more work for him to do. And we can all look at each other and say, really? No more work to do? Crosswell, start taking out missionaries from the field because there's no more work to do. International Baptist Missions, the greater missionary force in the United States, start taking their missionaries out of the Dominican Republic because there's no more work to do. And I'm here standing telling you there is a lot yet to be done in the Dominican Republic. By the way, I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. So Paul, and I'm not saying he was wrong, he was just stating, and we all know the conflicts that were going on at that time, that his time there was done. But we also see, as we will continue reading, that Paul was aware that the missionary work and the preaching of the gospel had to continue in Jerusalem, in Rome, and other places where Jewish and Gentiles were taking over. Verses 22 and 23 Now he acknowledged that he had no place in these parts. And like I just said, he personally didn't. But other people had a lot to do, and we'll see that as we continue to read. For which, verse 22, for which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. But now, having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire this many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. Now you understand what I meant when I said I struggle with King James. But what Paul is saying here is that he is on his way to Spain, who haven't heard of the gospel, which is his call to go to the unheard ones. Talking about the whomsoever. But he's saying, I have not forgotten about you guys and my desire to be with you. So it is important that as missionary agencies and big churches step out of country, they don't forget about those who are left behind. In the Dominican Republic, we have had the example of former missionaries who have had to come back and meet with pastor to say, please forgive us. Because of the way that they forgot of the churches that they have planted and left them alone. I'm not saying that these missionary agencies are going to come back and do that. I'm just saying that it has happened with missionaries, retired missionaries that we know. So for you missionary fellows that are here, think about that. I hope that you don't have to go back to Ecuador at one point because you left them abandoned, because you thought that the job was done. Because Paul didn't do that. And we'll continue to see his desire to be faithful to those that he was leaving behind. As we continue to read, chapter 20, verse 25. But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints, for it hath pleased them of Macedonia, and you have to help me on that one, Achaia, to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. What is happening here is beautiful. You have two churches, Gentile churches, that are now giving back to whom? And that's a question. I was told that I was allowed to ask questions. Who were they giving back to? Huh? The saints who were Jewish. There you go. So now you have Gentiles who are mature enough to be aware of their commitment. And it says in verse 27, as they were partakers of the spiritual gifts of the Jewish, now they know that they are called to be partakers of their needs as brothers and sisters in Christ. Isn't that beautiful? And nowadays we see churches that are splitting over the issue of Hispanics taking over. But what if the demographics are changing? What's the church going to do? What is the local church going to do? Are we going to argue or try to prevail? Is the supremacy going to prevail? Or is the gospel going to prevail? And for the gospel to prevail, we need to be aware that the lack of understanding on how demographics and people are changing is going to detriment the strategy of the local church. Verse 28, when therefore I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain. And it is not explicit here, but I can see Paul's interest of going to Rome so that Rome can be partakers of his ministry in Spain. Who is going to be the United States partakers of their ministries in Africa? Because I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Africa, the Western is not very well looked at. This side of the world, is not very well looked at. So who's going to be your partakers? I know a place in the Caribbean that has been influenced for missionaries for the last 100 and something years. 34 years of your influence in the Dominican Republic, right? 28? 28. Full-time influence. And I know a list of numerous missionaries and agencies who have been in the DR. Who do you think that are going to be your partakers in your ministry as you go? We now have young people in the Dominican Republic who are being trained and equipped to be missionaries. We now have young people in the Dominican Republic whose heart is striving about missions and where to go and how to do it. But they're lacking the resources. Okay, and isn't that what's happening here? We see resources coming from one place to another, Gentiles to Jewish. We see Paul looking forward to going to Rome before he goes to Spain because he knew that brothers and sisters from Rome were going to be his partakers in his ministry in Spain. And that is how we see the future of ministry changing, as the ones who have been equipped and trained and discipled and evangelized are now raising up as a new generation of missionaries with the energy, the desire to go and make disciples. And here am I standing as a representation of that generation of missionaries. And like I said before, to me it is a great, great, great privilege to have the opportunity to be here talking about something that I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure that Paul had a good understanding on how things were happening in Spain. And he knew that he was going to need the Spaniards, the Gentiles in general, in his ministry. And this is how I believe that the future of ministry is going to look like. People from every tongue and nation coming together to do the work that God wants them to do. May God bless you, and my wife and I continue. We look forward to spending more time with you guys during this week.
Just a question. In the Dominican Republic, you probably have a lot of Catholicism down there.
Yes, sir.
To what degree is that a hindrance to your ministry, or is it? Or what kind of challenges does that bring to you?
Well, the reality is that in the Dominican Republic, over 75% of the population claim themselves to be Catholics, but only 35% of those are practicing Catholics. So it makes it harder because you're trying to impact people who are basing their faith and their beliefs in traditions. And it is very hard to fight against traditions, especially when they have been transferred from generations. And we are seeing that happening in La Canela, where most of the people that we are working with there claim themselves to be Catholics. Most of them non-practicing, but still they're very attached to their traditions.
Which is where I'm going with this. We're talking about the future of missions. Do you think that particularly, I mean, and I know your experiences there is in the DR, but with the fact that you've got a lot who claim to be Catholic, but they are not practicing Catholics, as you go into the future, do you see that that'll make it easier or more difficult to reach those from Catholicism with the gospel?
I want to say both, depending, because a lot of people who are non-practicing, because they're not practicing, they claim themselves Catholic, but then they're leaning towards the secular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those who claim themselves Catholics at least live by faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Faith in what? Well, we don't know. That's what we need.
Faith in what? That's the key.
That's
that's the answer. What is
Exactly.
faith? Mm-hmm. Faith in the church or faith in Christ? Mm-hmm. And of course, we have that in the States as well. But you talk about the fact that there are a lot of places, and again, this ties into the future of missions. There are a lot of places where missionaries are leaving because they've been told that nation has been evangelized. Kevin and Trina Mayfield are down there in Ecuador. There have been mission boards leave Ecuador because they're saying that Ecuador is evangelized. Well, what is it? What's the percentage of those in Ecuador that you would say would truly be believers? 2%. And so you've got missions leaving a country in which they're saying it's evangelized, but there's 98% yet that need the Lord.
Exactly. And this is
Figure.
The same thing that happened with Paul. His job was done there, but he didn't say that the job was accomplished. And
that's a good point.
I believe that this is what is going on, and nothing against the Americans or missions from the United States, but I believe that what will make a difference in places like Ecuador and the Dominican Republic is for a new generation of locals to raise and be able to impact their communities. And this is what the reason why we decided to join forces with Koinonos and the Woodrins in the DR, because we share the same heart and passion of impacting and empowering the local church so that now they can take over the local ministry.
Get the locals, get the nationals to carry on the ministry. You train them in the gospel and get them to carry on the ministry. I think that's a great area, the future of missions. As we look at what we're doing in the United States and in the American church, I think for any number of reasons, in the years to come, we will be more involved in training others in other countries to build their church, to strengthen their church, to disciple their church, to grow and to go out from there. And I think that's what Paul did, didn't he? In every place that he went, he trained the locals to go about the work of the ministry even after he left.
And he equipped them, and he actually sent them or brought them with him.
That's right. Okay, sir. Thank you very much, Johnny. And you know what? If you're having a hard time reading English, you go ahead and read Spanish. We'll try to interpret as we follow along from here on in. How does that sound? I can understand. I wouldn't want to have to try to go read a Spanish Bible. That would be a mess, wouldn't it? But never thought of that too much. But there you go. You got it. All right. Well, thus ends our time here together this morning. And we want to thank those of you who came, those of you who are watching. We want to remind you that this evening at 6 o'clock, we'll be gathering for the Seder. And come on out and see what took place in the Passover, and even that's pictured in the Passover dinner, shows Jesus Christ and the work of Christ on the cross. That'll be tonight at 6 o'clock. And those of you joining us by the media ministries, if you're in the Altoona area, come on out and be a part. Now, when we dismiss, those of you who are not a part of the mission team may go home, but those of you who are a part of the mission team, we have lunch for you downstairs. So let's stand as we conclude in prayer, please. Father in heaven, as we come to you this morning,